Something happened in a factory in Grand Rapids, Michigan, in the autumn of 1964 that deserves closer examination than it has received. A plant manager named Bill Post, who worked for a biscuit company called Heckman and had nothing to do with the Post cereal company, despite sharing its name, had spent 4 months developing a product at the request of Kellogg's executives from Battle Creek. His own children had been his first taste testers. They had given the product a name, fruit scones. They used to ask their father to bring some home. The product was rectangular, filled with fruit preserve, truckerster, sealed inside a thin pastry shell, designed to be inserted into a home toaster and eaten warm. It required no refrigeration. It required no preparation beyond the toaster itself. It was a shelf-stable food product that a child could prepare alone. On September 14, 1964, that product went on sale in Cleveland, Ohio, under a new name. Not fruit scones, Pop-Tarts, a pun on the pop art movement that Andy Warhol had made famous, a deliberate linking of a mass-produced food item to a cultural movement whose very subject was mass-produced items. The first production run was 45,000 cases of each flavor, every case sold within months. Kellogg's ran a full-page advertisement in the Dayton Daily News on December 30th, 1964, reading, "Oops, we goofed, we ran out of Pop-Tarts." The advertisement, intended as an apology for the product shortage, instead functioned as the most effective demand creation tool the brand would ever produce. It told consumers that they had been missing something everyone else already wanted. Bill Post's plant ran 3 shifts. A second production line was added. The company recorded new peak sales and earnings of $349 million for 1964, according to the Battle Creek Inquirer. $3 billion. That is how many Pop-Tarts were sold in 2022, 60 years after those first 45,000 cases hit Cleveland shelves. In 2023, U.S. sales reached approximately $985 million. But where did all the money go? Who owns this now? And what happened to the factory, the brand, and the industry that built one of the most recognized food products in American history? That is the investigation. 1963 Battle Creek, Michigan, the cereal capital of the world. The two companies were practically neighbors. Kellogg's and Post Consumer Brands had both been founded in Battle Creek within a decade of each other at the turn of the 20th century, their origins rooted in the health food experiments of the Battle Creek Sanitarium. For 60 years, they had competed for the American breakfast table with a ferocity that the geographical proximity made peculiar. Executives from rival companies passing each other on the same streets, their factories separated by railroad tracks in the same Midwestern city. In the early 1960s, Post's Research and Development Department was working on a technology that had come out of the pet food division. Post had developed a process for dehydrating food and sealing it in foil to preserve it without refrigeration. The technology had been used successfully for Gaines Burgers, the semi-moist dog food product that had been a genuine innovation in pet nutrition. The question was whether the same process could be applied to human food. Specifically, whether it could be used to keep a fruit filling sealed inside a pastry shell, shelf-stable, without spoiling. On October 13, 1963, the Battle Creek Inquirer first reported that Post was working on an innovative breakfast snack. On February 16, 1964, Post unveiled Country Squares to the press and the food industry. A fruit-filled pastry that could be stored at room temperature, packaged 6 to a carton, available in strawberry, blueberry, grape, and orange pineapple flavors. The food industry was impressed. Grocers waited expectantly. The Post had one significant problem. Country Squares were not ready for the market. The mass production, the packaging, the distribution network, the pricing, none of it had been worked out to the point where the product could actually ship to stores. Post kept tinkering. The announcement had been made. The product was real. It simply could not be bought yet. William Lamothe, Kellogg's vice president, read the news about country squares and immediately recognized what it meant. His company's oldest competitor had identified a category that Kellogg's had not entered: a shelf-stable, handheld, toaster-prepared fruit pastry. The breakfast table was about to change, and Kellogg's was not going to change it first, unless someone moved very quickly. Lamothe called a plant manager at the Heckman Biscuit Company in Grand Rapids, Michigan, a man named Bill Post, whose facility was set up to produce cookies and crackers with the kind of equipment that might, with modification, produce a toaster pastry. Lamothe visited Grand Rapids. He showed Bill Post the concept. He asked one question: how fast? Bill Post's answer, by his own account, upset his bosses at the Heckman Company. He committed to making it happen, broke every internal rule to get there, requested equipment from other facilities without the necessary paperwork, used his own children as taste testers. 4 months. That was the timeline from Lamothe's visit to a product ready for test marketing. The product was initially called Fruit Scones. The name Bill Post's kids gave it. The marketing team changed it. The trademark application for Pop-Tarts was filed on July 20th, 1964. The product first appeared in Cleveland stores on September 14th, 1964. Post's country squares never recovered the first-mover advantage they had announced in February. The competition had beaten them to the shelf with a better name, better marketing, and 45,000 cases that disappeared before the year ended. The investigation question is this: what did Kellogg's do with the dominance it won in that 4-month sprint? And did it protect that dominance as carefully as it had acquired it? 1964, Battle Creek and New York City. The name Fruit Scones was not going to sell a product designed to be eaten by American children in 1964. Bill Post's children had used the name among themselves as an internal description of what their father kept bringing home. It was accurate. The pastry was a filled scone in the most basic structural sense, but it had no appeal to a mass market, no personality, no cultural charge. The cultural charge came from 3 blocks south of the Kellogg's marketing department's deliberations, from Andy Warhol's studio, from the paintings of Campbell's soup cans, and Marilyn Monroe's face in Coca-Cola bottles that had been redefining what American popular culture was willing to call art since the early 1960s. Pop art had made the mass-produced object the subject of serious aesthetic attention. It had made the supermarket shelf into a gallery. It had made the idea of a brand name into a philosophical statement. Kellogg's marketing executives, looking for a name that would attach their new product to the cultural electricity of the moment, settled on Pop-Tarts. The pop was the pop art movement. The tarts was the pastry form. The combination was a pun, a cultural reference, and a product description simultaneously. It was not an accident that the name worked. It was the result of people who understood that a breakfast food competing for the attention of American children in 1964 needed to be cool, needed to carry the implication that eating it was participation in something culturally significant. The trademark application filed July 20th, 1964, described the product as a fruit preserve-filled pastry bakery product. The design details had been worked out by Bill Post's team. Docker holes in the top of the pastry to allow steam to escape from the fruit filling when toasted, rounded corners, a diagonal crimp through the middle. In the original 4 flavors were strawberry, blueberry, brown sugar cinnamon, and apple currant, with the first 3 fruit varieties made using Smucker's jelly or preserves, and the cinnamon variety derived from a recipe that had been contributed by one of the workers' grandmothers. What the investigation finds in examining the name's origin is a pattern that would repeat throughout Pop-Tarts' history. The product's most consequential moments came when someone connected it to something larger than itself. The pop art naming was the first instance. The word pop did work that no amount of marketing copy could have purchased. The product hit stores in September. By December, it had sold out. By the following February, the Battle Creek Inquirer was reporting record Kellogg's earnings for 1964. The product that had been developed in 4 months was carrying the financial results of a century-old company. And Post's country squares eventually reached stores, but the first mover advantage had been surrendered in those months of laboratory tinkering. The product would eventually be renamed and repositioned, but it never became what Pop-Tarts became. The race was over before most consumers knew there had been one. 1967 to 1971. Battle Creek, Michigan. The first Pop-Tarts were unfrosted. This is worth pausing to examine because it speaks to the nature of the product development race that produced them. Bill Post's team had 4 months to build something that worked. They built something that worked. They did not build everything that was possible. The frosting came later. The technical challenge of the frosting was specific and not trivial. A frosting that looked appealing on the shelf needed to also survive the heat of a toaster without melting, dripping, becoming sticky, or burning. The team that had developed the original product set about solving this challenge after the product was already selling. By 1967, the solution was available. The first frosted Pop-Tarts appeared in 4 new flavors: Dutch apple, Concord grape, raspberry, and brown sugar cinnamon. By 1968, sprinkles had been added to several frosted varieties. The pattern being established here is worth noting from an investigative perspective. The product had been rushed to market in an unfrosted state. The frosting was a subsequent innovation. The sprinkles were a further iteration. While what Kellogg's was demonstrating in these years was a willingness to keep developing the product after it had already succeeded, to treat the initial launch not as the finished article, but as the platform. This is significant because many of the product's subsequent challenges would come from the opposite pattern, treating a successful product as finished, slowing the pace of meaningful innovation, allowing the brand to coast on identity rather than continuing to build what made the identity worth having. In 1971, Kellogg's introduced Milton the Toaster, a talking mascot character who would serve as the Pop-Tarts advertising spokesperson on television and radio. Milton was voiced by actor William Schallert, a recognizable television character actor of the era. The character ran through the 1970s, in generating merchandise that included mugs, plates, paint sets, and board games. Milton was, by accounts of the era, genuinely popular. Not in the brand asset sense of merely recognizable, but in the actual sense of beloved by the children who were eating the product. Milton was eventually retired, which is a decision that, in retrospect, is worth examining. The mascot that had connected the product to children's affection was put away before the brand had developed an equally effective replacement. The Crazy Good campaign that eventually followed launched in 2004, more than 3 decades after Milton. In the 1970s, the product's sales were growing. The formula was working. The factory in Battle Creek and the contract production at Heckman's Grand Rapids facility were running to meet demand. But the investigation must ask, what was the brand doing to ensure that the relationship with the next generation of consumers would be as strong as the relationship it had built with the generation that first encountered Pop-Tarts in the mid-1960s? 1964 to 1996. The American Breakfast Table. Here is the number that defines the investigation: 32. As of 2014, Pop-Tarts had recorded growth in sales for 32 consecutive years, 32 unbroken years of increasing revenue. This is an extraordinary performance for any consumer product, let alone one whose core formula had been established in 4 months in 1964. The investigation must account for what drove 32 consecutive years of growth, because understanding the engine that produced it is the only way to understand what has happened since. Part of the answer is demographic. The baby boom generation that first ate Pop-Tarts in the 1960s was followed by Generation X, who grew up with them in the 70s and 80s, followed by millennials who grew up with them in the 80s and 90s. Each generation inherited the product as part of the furniture of childhood. The product was not growing because new consumers were discovering something unfamiliar. It was growing because the consumer base was expanding as the population grew, and because each successive generation passed through the childhood years when Pop-Tarts occupied the pantry. Part of the answer is flavor expansion. The original 4 unfrosted flavors of 1964 had grown to more than 20 varieties by the 1990s, encompassing seasonal flavors, limited editions, novelty collaborations, and the kind of relentless iteration that keeps a brand present in the minds of consumers who are looking for something slightly different each year, while still buying from the same company. Part of the answer is the product's structural positioning. Pop-Tarts existed at the intersection of 2 consumer categories that were both growing throughout this period: the convenience breakfast category and the snack food category. The product was marketed as a breakfast item, but was eaten at all times of day by all ages. By the 1990s, the company was openly acknowledging that Pop-Tarts were consumed as afternoon snacks, as dessert accompaniments, as late-night foods. The product did not need to be frozen. It did not need to be refrigerated. It did not need to be prepared in any way that the average American household could not accomplish. These structural characteristics meant that the product was always accessible, always present, always one cabinet away from being eaten. But the investigation must also note what was not happening during these 32 years. The product was not substantially improving. The pastry crust technology of 1964 had not been fundamentally revised. The filling quality had not been raised to a standard that would make the product competitive with what a consumer interested in authentic ingredients could now obtain from other sources. The brand was growing because the market was growing, and because the product was being purchased by loyalty and habit, rather than by active preference. The investigation must ask, what happens when the generation that grew up with Pop-Tarts develops other options? When the convenience that Pop-Tarts provided in 1964 becomes available from products that offer additional qualities, Pop-Tarts do not? If you are finding this investigation compelling, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Every subscriber is why this channel can continue producing these deep dive investigations into the brands and factories that built American food culture. October 2nd, 2023, Battle Creek and Chicago. On October 2nd, 2023, the Kellogg Company, one of the oldest and most recognized food corporations in American history, founded by W.K. Kellogg in Battle Creek in 1906, ceased to exist as a unified company. It was split into 2 separate publicly traded corporations. The North American Cereal Division became W.K. Kellogg Company, retaining Battle Creek as its headquarters and the New York Stock Exchange ticker symbol KLG. It would continue to produce Corn Flakes, Frosted Flakes, Rice Krispies, and the other cereal brands that had defined the company since its founding. The Snacks and International Division became Kellanova, based in Chicago, trading under ticker symbol K. Kellanova's portfolio included Pringles, Cheez-It, Eggo waffles, Nutri-Grain, RX Bar, and Pop-Tarts. The investigation asks, what does this separation tell us about Pop-Tarts' position? The answer requires understanding why Kellogg's made the split in the first place. The North American cereal business was a declining category. Cereal consumption in the United States had been falling as consumers shifted to other breakfast options. The cereal business was slower growing, lower margin, and facing structural headwinds that no amount of brand investment was likely to reverse. The snacks and international business was growing faster, generating better margins, and had better prospects for international expansion. Pop-Tarts was assigned to Kellanova, to the growth company, not the declining company. This is significant. In the analysis of Kellogg's leadership, Pop-Tarts was a growth asset, not a legacy asset. Its assignment to Kellanova, rather than W.K. Kellogg, was an institutional declaration that Pop-Tarts belonged to the future. Kellanova's general manager of portable wholesome snacks, Ollie Morton, was explicit about the brand's trajectory. In late 2023, he described Pop-Tarts as approaching $1 billion in annual U.S. sales and said, "We're actually even more excited about how we go and close the next opportunity down and how we continue to be relevant." Close the next opportunity down is the language of a brand that believes it has room to grow. The investigation must weigh this against what was happening in the wider market. The snacking category that Kellanova relied upon was also facing growing competition from a proliferation of alternatives that had not existed 20 years earlier. Every year, more products competed for the moment when a consumer reached for something quick, sweet, and portable. What Pop-Tarts had that most competitors did not was a childhood. Most Americans had grown up with it. The brand had the specific power of the nostalgic first taste. The sensory memory of childhood mornings that is one of the most durable forms of consumer loyalty in the food industry. The investigation must determine whether nostalgia is enough when the market has fundamentally changed. December 28, 2023. Camping World Stadium, Orlando, Florida. Here is the event that any honest investigation of Pop-Tarts' recent history must center on. Pop-Tarts had sponsored a college football bowl game in Orlando. The game had previously been called the Cheez-It Bowl. The sponsorship had been shifted to Pop-Tarts when Kellanova decided Pop-Tarts was the brand it wanted, associated with the viral potential of college football's bowl season. The first Pop-Tarts Bowl was played on December 28, 2023. Between Kansas State and North Carolina State. The game itself was unremarkable. The marketing event that surrounded it was extraordinary. Prior to the game, a life-sized anthropomorphic Pop-Tart, a mascot in a large costume representing a frosted strawberry Pop-Tart named Strawberry, danced with fans on the field, interacted with officials, and performed the kind of high-energy mascot entertainment that bowl games routinely feature. Kansas State won the game, 28-19. What happened next is the moment the investigation must examine carefully. Following the final whistle, the Pop-Tarts mascot climbed atop a giant toaster that had been wheeled onto the field. The mascot held a sign that read, "Dreams really do come true." Then, to music, the mascot descended into the toaster. A giant edible replica of a frosted strawberry Pop-Tart was produced from the bottom. Kansas State players crowded around it and ate it. The Pop-Tarts Bowl account posted on social media, "Leave no crumbs." The internet's reaction was immediate, overwhelming, and entirely unexpected in its warmth. The campaign won the Cannes Lions Grand Prix in the brand experience and activation category. It won a Grand Clio and an Andy IDA Award, and was named Brand Activation of the Year by Sports Business Journal. Over the subsequent 6 months, for approximately 30% of all Pop-Tarts social media mentions originated from this single event, according to data from the analytics platform Talkwalker. The investigation asks, why did this work? The answer is that the edible mascot stunt understood something about Pop-Tarts that decades of conventional advertising had not fully leveraged. The brand had always been, at its core, about the cheerful surrender of the pastry to being eaten. It was a food designed to be consumed without ceremony, without guilt, at whatever temperature and time the consumer chose. The mascot's willingness to be sacrificed, to embrace its own consumption as its highest aspiration, was a perfect metaphor for what made the product appealing. The dark comedy of the event landed because it was consistent with what the brand already meant. The brand spent decades building that meaning. One event articulated it in a way that 60 years of advertising had not quite accomplished. August 14, 2024, McLean, Virginia, and Chicago. The investigation reaches its most consequential document on August 14, 2024, when Mars Incorporated, the privately held company that produces M&M's, Snickers, Pedigree dog food, and Royal Canin, announced its intention to acquire Kellanova for $35.9 billion in cash. This is the largest food sector acquisition since J.M. Smucker's purchase of Hostess for $5.6 billion. $35.9 billion for Pringles, Cheez-It, Eggo, RX Bar, Nutri-Grain, and Pop-Tarts. The transaction received regulatory approval in the United States from the Federal Trade Commission without significant challenge, as the FTC determined the overlap between Mars' confectionery portfolio and Kellanova's snack brands was insufficient to threaten market competition. The European Commission's approval came on December 8, 2025, completing the final regulatory requirement. The acquisition closed on December 11, 2025. Pop-Tarts is now owned by Mars Incorporated. The investigation must examine what this means. Mars paid $35.9 billion primarily for scale in the global snacking market, the ability to compete against PepsiCo's Frito-Lay division and Mondelez International, with a portfolio broad enough to negotiate shelf space and distribution from a position of genuine power. The Pringles brand was worth billions to Mars because of its global distribution presence. The Cheez-It brand was worth billions because of its dominant position in the snack cracker category. What Pop-Tarts brings to Mars is different. It brings a product with close to $1 billion in annual U.S. sales, a cultural identity that extends far beyond its financial performance, and the specific quality of being the product that most Americans first encountered as children. Mars has described its ambition as doubling its snacking business over the next decade. The investigation must consider what that ambition means for Pop-Tarts specifically. A company that made its fortune on Snickers and M&M's understands confectionery, global distribution, and the power of sugar-forward products in the snacking category. It understands consumer loyalty built on the combination of taste and memory. Pop-Tarts fits those parameters. What Mars does not have is a history of managing breakfast category products for a market that increasingly asks questions about nutrition, processing, and ingredient quality. The question the investigation puts to Mars is not whether Pop-Tarts will survive the acquisition. It will. The question is whether Mars will push the brand toward the nutritional positioning that the next generation of consumers is demanding, or whether it will manage it primarily as a cash flow asset in its portfolio while focusing its innovation budget on other priorities. Bill Post, who developed Pop-Tarts in 4 months in 1964 and lived to see the product he built become part of a $36 billion transaction, died on February 10, 2024, at the age of 96. He never saw the Mars acquisition completed. His children, the original fruit scone taste testers, were invited to the Los Angeles premiere of Unfrosted, Jerry Seinfeld's Netflix film loosely based on the Pop-Tarts origin story, in April 2024. His son Dan and daughter Rachel attended. They met Seinfeld. They received Pop-Tart socks. Dan gave Seinfeld a commemorative Kellogg's watch his father had never opened. 2001 to 2010. Kandahar and Times Square. The investigation surfaces 2 data points about Pop-Tarts that are not widely discussed, but that reveal something precise about how the brand had embedded itself in American institutional life by the turn of the 21st century. First, in the initial days of the United States military operation in Afghanistan in October 2021, the U.S. military airdropped 2.4 million Pop-Tarts. This is not a detail from a promotional campaign. This is from military planning records. The rationale was the same rationale that had driven the U.S. Army to commission Chef Boyardee for military rations during World War II. Shelf-stable, calorie-dense, a palatable food that required no preparation, traveled well, and was already trusted by American consumers. Pop-Tarts had become, by 2001, the kind of product that military logistics planners thought of when they thought about what American civilians recognizably ate. Second, on August 10, 2010, Pop-Tarts World opened in Times Square as a temporary retail installation. The store included Pop-Tarts memorabilia, a t-shirt making station, a Pop-Tarts World Cafe featuring a sushi bar, yes, a sushi bar using Pop-Tarts as ingredients, and a vending machine called the Varietizer. The store was not a permanent facility. It was a marketing event, a physical manifestation of the brand's willingness to treat itself as a cultural artifact worthy of a museum and a restaurant, simultaneously. The sushi bar was the investigation's favorite detail. Someone at Kellogg decided that the correct expression of Pop-Tarts' cultural authority in 2010 was to put Pop-Tarts inside sushi rolls, and that this was a thing Times Square would accept. These two data points, the military airdrop and the Times Square sushi, bracket something important. By the early 21st century, Pop-Tarts had become a product that could be used to feed soldiers in a war zone, and could also be used as a restaurant ingredient in Midtown Manhattan, and both of these uses were taken seriously by the people deploying them. The brand had achieved the specific kind of ubiquity where it could be made to mean almost anything without losing its identity. This is a genuine achievement. It is also a potential vulnerability. A brand that can be made to mean almost anything has a harder time asserting a specific, defensible meaning when the market becomes more competitive and consumers become more selective about what their food choices say about them. 1964 to 2025. The ingredient panel. Here is the investigation's most uncomfortable finding. The original Pop-Tart of September 14, 1964, was made with enriched flour, fruit preserves, partially hydrogenated vegetable shortening, sugar, and a short list of other ingredients. The Pop-Tart of 2025 is made with enriched flour, fruit fillings, vegetable oil, sugar, high fructose corn syrup, and an ingredient list that has grown in length but not improved in quality of components. The investigation does not make health claims. It makes a market observation. The consumer who is buying food in 2025 has access to information and alternatives that did not exist in 1964. The organic food movement, the clean label movement, the rise of brands built on ingredient transparency, the proliferation of premium snack alternatives at accessible price points. All of these have created a consumer environment where the question, "What's in this?" is asked more often than it was when Pop-Tarts first appeared. Pop-Tarts' response to this environment has been incremental. In 2024, Kellogg launched Pop-Tarts Protein, a line that added protein content to the classic format in response to the survey finding that 70% of Americans were trying to consume more protein, up from 59% in 2022. This is a genuine product innovation. It is also a defensive move, an acknowledgement that the product's core formula was not addressing a consumer need that had become dominant. The investigation finds that the brand's core product, frosted strawberry, brown sugar cinnamon, the foundational flavors that account for the majority of the $3 billion annual sales, has not been meaningfully fully reformulated to address the concerns of the health-conscious consumer. It remains a highly processed, sugar-forward product that is categorically incompatible with the dietary frameworks that a growing segment of its potential market has adopted. This is not necessarily fatal. Oreos are also a highly processed, sugar-forward product. So is every variety of Pringles. The snacking category has demonstrated repeatedly that consumers will choose taste and nostalgia over nutritional optimization when the gap in satisfaction is large enough. Pop-Tart's taste profile, That specific combination of pastry sweetness, fruit filling, frosting, and the particular texture that results from toasting is genuinely distinctive and genuinely enjoyable. But the investigation must note that the brand is now owned by Mars, Incorporated, whose candy bars and chocolate products occupy the same occasional indulgence consumer mental category. The risk of the Mars acquisition, from a Pop-Tarts perspective, is not that Mars will fail to market the product. It is that Mars will manage the product as it manages M&Ms, as an accepted indulgence product with a loyal consumer base, rather than doing the harder work of positioning Pop-Tarts for a generation that is asking different questions about food than the generation that first ate them in 1964. 2022, the American snacking market. 3 billion Pop-Tarts sold in 2022. Let the investigation sit with that number. 3 billion individual pastries. At approximately 2 pastries per package, that is 1.5 billion packages. At approximately 4 packages per box, that is approximately 375 million boxes. At an average retail price of approximately $4 per box. But that is $1.5 billion in retail value from a product that generates close to $1 billion in manufacturer revenues. The number 3 billion is one of the largest annual unit sale figures for any single packaged food product in the United States. It places Pop-Tarts in a category of consumer products, alongside Oreo cookies, Lay's potato chips, and a small number of other brands, where the scale of consumption is so large that it has become its own kind of argument for the product's validity. A product that 3 billion units of Americans ate in a single year cannot be described as niche, cannot be described as fading, cannot be described as losing relevance in any meaningful sense. Yet the investigation must place 3 billion units in context. The toaster pastry category that Pop-Tarts created in 1964 is now populated by competitors. Pillsbury's Toaster Strudel, store-brand alternatives in every major grocery chain, and a growing number of premium pastry products in the refrigerated section that offer higher quality ingredients and a more sophisticated eating experience. Pop-Tarts' market share within the toaster pastry category remains dominant, but the total size of the category is constrained by the structural changes in how Americans eat breakfast. Cereal consumption is declining in the United States. Breakfast skipping is rising among younger consumers who leave the house without eating and address their morning hunger with coffee or a snack later in the day. The toaster pastry category depends on a domestic breakfast routine that a significant portion of the consumer population no longer practices. Pop-Tarts' response to this trend has been to position itself increasingly as an all-day snack rather than a breakfast food, a repositioning that the brand's usage data already supported, since a substantial percentage of Pop-Tarts have always been eaten outside of breakfast hours. The Crazy Good advertising campaign, which launched in 2004 and ran for many years afterward, explicitly embraced the idea of Pop-Tarts as a snack pursued at any time of day by consumers who were compelled by craving rather than scheduled by mealtime. The investigation finds that this repositioning is directionally correct. It is also not finished. A brand that is genuinely the snack category leader for a generation of consumers who associate it with both childhood memory and contemporary viral moments. The Pop-Tarts Bowl edible mascot won the Cannes Lions Grand Prix in 2024, has significant runway to build on. The question is who is running. 2025. Battle Creek, Michigan, and Chicago, Illinois. The Pop-Tarts factory is in Battle Creek, Michigan, at 425 Porter Street. The address that has been associated with Kellogg's production since the company was founded in 1906. It is part of the manufacturing network that W.K. Kellogg Company and Kellanova split between them in the October 2023 corporate separation, with Pop-Tarts production remaining under the Kellanova, now Mars, umbrella. The factory is not open to public tours. Kellogg's offered factory tours beginning in 1912. Over the following 74 years, more than 6 million people visited the Battle Creek facility and watched cereal being made. The tours were discontinued in 1986, citing safety and corporate espionage concerns. Cereal City, USA, a museum and exhibit center that opened in 1998, provided a simulation of the production process, but was itself closed in 2007. What remains in Battle Creek today is a production facility, not a tourist destination. The building where Pop-Tarts are made is operational and not accessible to the public. The city that built its identity around breakfast food manufacturing, the city that called itself the cereal capital of the world, that built its tourism economy around factory visits and breakfast food mythology, now exists in a relationship with its defining industry that is primarily economic rather than experiential. The investigation notes that the plant receives investment. In 2024, production from Kellogg's Omaha, Nebraska, and Memphis, Tennessee facilities was being consolidated into Battle Creek, Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and Belleville, Ontario, as part of a network optimization costing between $450 million and $500 million. Battle Creek was not being abandoned. It was being preserved as a production center while less efficient plants elsewhere were closed. But the investigation also notes that the brand's headquarters are now in Chicago, under Mars. The decisions about what Pop-Tarts becomes next, what flavors are introduced, how the brand is marketed, whether the Pop-Tarts Bowl continues, whether the protein line expands, whether the brand's 50% of the toaster pastry category is treated as something to protect or something to grow, will be made not in Battle Creek, but in offices connected to a company whose primary identity is as a global confectionery company, not a breakfast food company. The investigation began with a question. What happened to the factory, the brand, and the industry that built one of the most recognized food products in American history? Here is what the investigation found. The factory in Battle Creek is operational. The brand is alive, generating close to $1 billion in annual U.S. revenues, and has been acquired for $35.9 billion as part of the Kellanova portfolio, now owned by Mars, Incorporated. The product continues to sell 3 billion units per year. By any financial measure, the Pop-Tarts empire has not faded. It has, in fact, grown consistently for most of its 60-year history. But 3 specific findings give the investigation pause. First, the product has not materially changed since 1964. The pastry crust that Bill Post's team developed in 4 months in Grand Rapids has been iterated. Frosting in 67, sprinkles in 68, new flavors every year. But the core engineering of the product has not been fundamentally revised. In a market where clean label products, reduced ingredient snacks, and nutritionally improved alternatives are growing faster than the conventional snacking category, this represents a deferred obligation that the brand will eventually need to address. Second, the institutional continuity that sustained the brand through 32 consecutive years of growth no longer exists in the same form. Bill Post died in 2024 at 96. The factory tours that connected 6 million visitors to the actual production process of American breakfast food ended in 1986. The management decisions about the brand's future are being made in Chicago by a company whose primary expertise is in Mars bars and pedigree dog food, not toaster pastries. The cultural knowledge embedded in the product's origin, the 4-month sprint, the children as taste testers, the fruit scones that became Pop-Tarts, is now primarily historical rather than operational. Third, the most important thing Pop-Tarts has going for it is a category of consumer asset that cannot be manufactured, purchased, or strategized into existence. 3 billion people, 3 billion units sold in a single year represents 3 billion individual choices made by people who, when they reached for something sweet and portable, reached for the thing they remembered. That memory is the product. The pastry is the delivery mechanism. As long as the memory persists, as long as there are Americans who grew up eating frosted strawberry Pop-Tarts before school, and who now buy them for children who are making their own breakfast memories, the brand will survive any corporate transaction, any ownership change, in any disruption in the snacking category. The investigation's verdict? The empire has not faded. But the people who built it are gone. The factory is not something you can visit and smell and see. And the company that owns the brand is the third owner since the family that developed it handed it to a corporation 60 years ago. That is not a crisis. It is a condition. And the question the investigation leaves open is whether Mars, Incorporated, a company that knows how to make candy last for a century, also knows how to make a Pop-Tart last for another 60 years. Bill Post's kids ate the first ones. Their grandchildren are eating the same recipe now. The toaster is still on the counter.